I've always believed in the importance of routine. I liked knowing what was coming next, planning out my day, even if my job wasn't exactly predictable. Being a construction site manager meant long hours and constant stress, deadlines, inspections, keeping people on track. It didn't leave much room for anything else, least of all spontaneity. Rachel, my wife, she's the opposite. She thrives on unpredictability, on those moments when life throws you a curveball. I suppose that's one of the reasons I fell for her in the first place. Her ability to shake up my world, to remind me that not everything had to be controlled. But lately, things had been different. We'd been different. The past few months had been tough. She was working overtime as a graphic designer, deadlines piling up, the pressure suffocating her. I knew the feeling all too well, but we'd been taking it out on each other. Little arguments about nothing, really. But they built up. That night had been one of those nights. A minor disagreement about dinner had turned into a tense silence, the kind that gnawed at both of us, and I could see it in her eyes, that look of frustration, disappointment. We weren't connecting anymore, not like we used to. She'd suggested the drive as a way to break the tension. It was something we used to do when we were dating, get in the car late at night and just go. No destination, no plan, just the road ahead. I hadn't wanted to at first, but when I saw the look on her face, I knew it was her way of trying to bring us back to something familiar, something comfortable. So, we left our apartment a little after midnight, with nothing but the open road in front of us. We didn't talk much at first. The car's engine hummed softly beneath us, the low glow of the dashboard lights casting shadows across Rachel's face as she stared out the window. I glanced at her every so often, wondering if she was thinking the same thing I was, that we needed this. We needed a reset, a way to step outside the mess of work, stress, and arguments that had taken over our lives. As we drove, the city began to fall away, replaced by long stretches of highway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. There was something peaceful about it, something almost hypnotic. The fields on either side of us were cloaked in darkness, the sky heavy with clouds hiding the stars. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, just me, Rachel, and the road. I stole another glance at her, hoping for some sign that the tension between us was easing, but she was still quiet, her fingers absent-mindedly drumming on the armrest. The silence wasn't awkward, it was just there, lingering like a third presence in the car. I turned the radio on, hoping for a distraction, but all I got was static. I flipped through the channels, but none of them seemed to work. "Guess we're on our own tonight," I muttered, mostly to myself. Rachel smiled faintly, but didn't say anything. The miles rolled on, and before long, the gas gauge dipped lower than I was comfortable with. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was nearing empty. I glanced at the dashboard, silently cursing myself for not filling up before we left. There was nothing around us but empty fields and the occasional flash of distant headlights. If we didn't find a gas station soon, we'd be stranded out here. "We're getting low," I said, breaking the silence. Rachel looked over at the gauge, her brow furrowing slightly. "Do you think there's a station nearby?" "I hope so," I replied, squinting at the dark horizon. "We don't have much choice." A few more minutes passed, and just when I was starting to worry, I saw it, a flicker of light up ahead, like a beacon in the night. A gas station, dimly lit but unmistakable. Relief flooded through me. "There," I said. Rachel nodded, her eyes fixed on the station as we approached. It looked old, run down, the kind of place you'd expect to see in the middle of nowhere. The neon sign flickered weakly, barely readable, and the parking lot was empty except for a few rusted cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. "Creepy," Rachel muttered under her breath. "Yeah," I agreed, pulling up to one of the pumps. I killed the engine, but the moment the car went quiet, I felt a strange, creeping sensation. It was subtle, just a nagging feeling at the back of my mind, like something was off. I glanced at Rachel, and by the look on her face, I knew she felt it too. "Let's just get the gas and go," she said, her voice tight. I nodded, stepping out of the car and heading toward the gas station's small convenience store. Inside, the store was as rundown as the exterior suggested. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh, yellow glow over the worn linoleum floors and dusty shelves. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. old magazine racks, faded advertisements for long-forgotten products, and behind the counter, a lone attendant sat, staring blankly ahead. The man was old, his skin leathery and wrinkled, his deep-set eyes following me as I approached. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded toward the register, his expression unreadable. His uniform was faded, the name tag barely legible, and for a moment, I wondered how long he'd been working here. "Just need to fill up," I said, trying to keep my voice light. The man didn't respond, just nodded again, his gaze drifting toward the clock behind him. I followed his eyes and felt a flicker of confusion. The clock read 3:17 a.m., but my watch said it was barely 12:45 a.m. "Your clock's fast," I said, pointing at it. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the comment, just stared. I felt Rachel's hand on my arm, and I turned to see her looking around, her brow furrowed in confusion. "The clocks," she whispered. "They're all different." I glanced around, realizing she was right. There were several clocks scattered around the store, one above the door, another near the magazine rack, and yet another above the restroom. Each one showed a different time: 8:22 p.m., 2:05 a.m., 12:01 a.m. The one above the restroom was flashing, like it had reset itself. "Must be broken," I muttered. Something was wrong. The air in the store felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite place. I handed over the cash to the attendant, who barely seemed to acknowledge the transaction. As we turned to leave, I heard him mutter something, just barely audible. "You've been here before." I stopped, turning back to him. "What did you say?" The man didn't respond. He was already staring off into space again, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "Let's go," Rachel said, tugging at my arm. There was an urgency in her voice that made me comply without question. We got back into the car, both of us unnerved but trying not to show it. As I started the engine, Rachel glanced over at me. "Did he seem weird to you?" "Weird is an understatement," I said, pulling away from the pump. "Let's just get out of here." A few minutes later, we were back on the road, driving into the darkness once again. I tried to push the strangeness of the gas station out of my mind, focusing on the road ahead. But something about that place lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Then Rachel said the words that made my blood run cold. "Is that the same gas station?" I looked up and my stomach dropped. There it was, just ahead of us, the same rundown station, the same flickering neon sign, the same rusted cars. It didn't make sense. We hadn't turned around, we hadn't even veered off the road. But somehow, we were right back where we started. "That's impossible," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. We were driving straight the whole time. Rachel's face had gone pale. "Mark, what's happening?" I didn't have an answer. I drove past the gas station, not stopping, and determined to keep going. There had to be a logical explanation for this. Maybe we'd missed something. But as we drove further, the unsettling feeling only grew. The road stretched on, endless and dark, but no matter how far we went, we kept coming back to that same gas station. Again and again. I tried to shake it off. It had to be a mistake. Maybe I'd missed a turn without realizing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The creeping dread in the pit of my stomach told me this was something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I took a deep breath and gripped the steering wheel harder, trying to sound calm for Rachel's sake. "We must have made a wrong turn. I'll try a different route." "Mark," Rachel whispered, her voice tight with fear, "we didn't make a wrong turn." Her words hung in the air, thick and unsettling. She was right. We hadn't made any turns at all. We'd been driving straight. Without saying anything else, I kept driving, passing the gas station and pushing the car forward. The tension between us was palpable. The silence between us loaded. I could feel Rachel's eyes on me. Could sense the unspoken question she was too afraid to ask. The sky was still overcast, thick clouds blotting out any light from the stars or moon. The only illumination came from our headlights, cutting a narrow path through the dark, and the occasional flicker of headlights from distant cars, always far off, always disappearing as quickly as they came. And then the gas station appeared again. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly as it came to a halt. We were both staring at the flickering neon sign, the rundown pumps, the rusted cars that hadn't moved. It was the same gas station. "It's not possible," I muttered under my breath, my voice sounding hollow, even to me. Rachel's breathing had quickened. "Mark, what the hell is happening? We've been driving straight for over 10 minutes. How are we back here again?" I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. But there was no logic to this. Nothing that made any sense. But then I noticed the time. My watch read 1:10 a.m. "Rachel, check your phone again," I said. My voice tight. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. "It says 4:30, but that doesn't make sense. It's only been like 30 minutes since we left the gas station." The dread that had been simmering beneath the surface flared into full-blown panic. "The clocks in the store were wrong too," I said, more to myself than to her. "It's like time isn't." I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. Rachel was staring at the radio now, her eyes wide. "Mark," she whispered, "listen." The radio had been dead for the entire drive, just static. But now, through the crackling interference, I could hear something. A voice. Faint at first, but growing clearer, like it was fighting through the static to reach us. And it was saying our names. Mark. Rachel. The voice was distorted, warping in and out, but it was unmistakable. It was Rachel's voice. She recoiled in her seat, her face going pale. That's me." I reached for the dial, turning the radio off. The voice vanished, but the silence it left behind was somehow worse. We sat there for a long moment, both of us too stunned to speak. Eventually, I started the car again, but there was no escape, no other road. All we could do was keep going forward, and hope that, eventually, we'd find a way out of whatever nightmare we'd stumbled into. We passed the gas station again, but this time, something was different. There were cars in the lot now, cars that hadn't been there before. The rusted hulks were still there, but parked alongside them were a few newer models, sleek and shiny, as if they had only just arrived. And inside the store, I could see people moving between the shelves, flickers of movement that hadn't been there during our previous visits. "Look," Rachel said, her voice trembling as she pointed toward the station. "There are people." I pulled into the lot, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. "Maybe they can help us. Or maybe they're stuck too," she muttered, but I could hear the faint glimmer of hope in her voice. We got out of the car, the air heavy and thick, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on us. The gas station looked the same as before, run down, ancient, but now it had an almost alive feeling to it. As we stepped inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting the same sickly yellow glow over the store. But this time, we weren't alone. An older woman stood near the magazine rack, her eyes fixed on us as soon as we walked in. She didn't blink, didn't smile, just stared. Her expression was vacant, her face pale and gaunt, as if she hadn't slept in years. At the counter, a tall, thin man was purchasing a candy bar. I watched as he handed over the cash, then immediately unwrapped the bar and took a bite. Then, without saying a word, he walked back to the shelves, picked up the same candy bar, and walked back to the counter to buy it again. It was like they were stuck on a loop, repeating the same actions over and over, unaware of anything outside their own small, repetitive world. Rachel's grip tightened on my arm. "Something's wrong with them." "Yeah," I whispered, my eyes darting around the store. "Let's just ask if they've seen anything." As I approached the man at the counter, I opened my mouth to ask him something. Anything that might give us a clue about what was going on. But before I could say a word, he slid another $1 across the counter, bought the same candy bar he'd already purchased, and without so much as glancing in my direction, he turned and walked toward the door. I watched him leave, my pulse quickening with a sense of unease. The door jingled as he stepped outside, and through the dingy glass, I saw him make his way to an old beat-up car parked at the far end of the lot. He moved slowly, methodically. Rachel was standing beside me, staring too. "Mark? What's wrong with him?" "I don't know," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the man. He reached his car, his hand gripping the door handle. But then, just like that, he was gone. Not gone as in he got in the car and drove away. He disappeared. Vanished. One moment, he was there. The next, he wasn't. Like he'd been erased from existence. Rachel gasped, stepping closer to me, her hand gripping my arm. Did you see that?" I nodded, too stunned to speak. We stood frozen, staring at the spot where the man had been just moments before. I half expected to see him reappear, maybe stepping out from behind the car or from the shadows, but the lot remained eerily still, empty. "What the hell?" I muttered, taking a step back toward the door. My hand instinctively went to the handle, ready to leave. But then I heard it, the soft shuffle of feet behind us. The same man was walking toward the counter again. My blood ran cold. He emerged from one of the aisles, his expression blank as before, the same candy bar in his hand. He approached the counter like he hadn't just vanished outside, like he hadn't left the store at all. His movements were identical, his gait deliberate, as if he was repeating the same action, caught in some unending loop. The attendant didn't say a word. He didn't even look surprised. He just took the dollar, slid the candy bar across the counter, and the man turned to walk away, heading right back toward the door. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Rachel tugged at my sleeve. "Mark, what's happening? Is this real?" Before I could answer, the door to the gas station jingled again. My breath hitched as I turned to see who had entered. It was the old woman from before, the one who had been standing by the magazine rack, staring at us earlier. Except now, she was walking in through the door, like she had never been inside the store. Her pale, wrinkled face remained expressionless as she made her way past us, her slow footsteps dragging across the floor. But instead of heading to a different part of the store, she walked right back to where she had stood before, near the magazines, and resumed her position, her eyes once again locking onto us, unblinking. The man at the counter finished his transaction, and just like before, he stepped outside. I watched him carefully this time, my stomach twisting in knots as he made his way to his car. He reached for the handle again, but the moment his hand touched it, he vanished. My head spun, the world tilting around me. None of this was making any sense. Rachel's grip tightened around my arm, and when I turned to look at her, I could see the panic rising in her eyes. "Mark, we need to get out of here. Now." But before we could, I spotted something that made my heart stop. A photo board hanging near the back of the store. At first glance, it looked like a typical bulletin board, the kind you'd see in any small-town shop. Pictures of regular customers, snapshots of smiling faces. But as I got closer, my breath caught in my throat. There, among the photos, was a picture of Rachel and me, standing by our car. The photo had tonight's date written beneath it. "Rachel," I called, my voice shaking. She came to my side, her eyes widening as she saw the picture. That's not possible. We didn't take any pictures." I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The more I looked, the more I began to recognize the faces in the other photos. Some were people I hadn't seen in years, old friends from high school, and a neighbor who'd disappeared without a trace. And all of them had dates beneath their photos, dates that didn't make sense, dates that hadn't happened yet. We ran for the door, both of us breathless with panic. But as we stepped outside, the gas station seemed to warp, the lights dimming, the air thickening. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it, but the world felt wrong, like reality itself was stretching, bending. "Mark," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think we can leave." Her words echoed in my head, chilling me to the bone. I wanted to deny it, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that we just needed to keep trying. But deep down, I knew she was right. We were trapped, caught in some kind of loop, and every attempt to escape only brought us back to the same place. Maybe there's something in the back office, some kind of clue, something that can explain this. Together, we ran around the side of the building, heading for the small office at the back of the station. The door was unlocked, and inside we found an old desk, cluttered with papers and logbooks. I rifled through the drawers, hoping for anything that would make sense of this nightmare. Then, I found it. An old logbook dated decades ago. The entries were short, scribbled hastily, but the more I read, the more my heart raced. Each entry detailed strange occurrences at the gas station, time distortions, customers trapped in loops, people who vanished without a trace. And the last entry made my blood run cold. It mentioned a couple who had died in a car accident after driving around the gas station at night. The entry was signed with our names. I stumbled back from the desk, the weight of it all crashing down on me. "Rachel." But before I could finish, the radio in the office crackled to life. The same distorted voice, Rachel's voice, came through the speakers, announcing a car crash involving a young couple. The description of the car was ours. The names were ours. As the broadcast continued, it became clear. We were the couple in the report. We were the ones who had crashed, the ones who had died. At this point, we decided to go back inside the gas station and try to figure out what was happening. I pushed open the glass door, hearing the faint jingle of the bell overhead. The air inside felt different this time, stale, colder, like it had been left untouched for years. But when we stepped inside, something wasn't right. The clerk, the old man with the leathery skin and deep-set eyes, was gone. In his place stood another attendant, a younger guy, maybe in his mid-20s. He wore a modern uniform, with a name tag that read Danny pinned to his chest, and his expression was more lively, but no less unsettling. He glanced up as we entered, flashing a customer service smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, his voice too cheery for the atmosphere in the room. I stopped in my tracks, my head spinning with confusion. "Where's the other guy?" "The older man?" I asked, glancing around the store as if he might be hiding somewhere. The clerk's smile faltered for a second, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Older man?" he repeated. "I've been working here all night. There's no one else." Rachel's grip tightened on my arm. I could feel the tremble in her fingers, the same fear that was creeping up my spine. "Mark, this isn't right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, trying to keep my composure, but the strangeness of it all was starting to wear me down. "We need to use the bathroom," I muttered, more as an excuse to get away from the eerie conversation. I didn't know why I said it. Maybe I just needed a moment to think, to catch my breath, to figure out what the hell was happening. The clerk nodded, pointing toward the back of the store. Down the hall, last door on the right. I led Rachel through the narrow aisle toward the restroom, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. We reached the restroom, and I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, a sharp, musty odor that made my stomach turn. It smelled like something had been rotting inside, though the room itself looked clean, sterile in a way that didn't match the rest of the gas station. Rachel hovered in the doorway as I stepped inside, the harsh light making the tiles look almost gray. There was something unsettling about the silence in here, a kind of heaviness that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then I saw the writing. Scrawled across the walls in black marker were messages, hundreds of them, overlapping and crisscrossing each other. Some of the words were faded, barely legible, while others were fresh, the ink still sharp and stark against the white tile. "No one leaves. It never ends. Beware the time thief." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and my breath caught in my throat. I took a step closer, running my fingers over the writing, feeling the rough texture of the ink beneath my skin. Rachel gasped behind me. "Mark? What is this?" I shook my head, swallowing hard. "I don't know, but we need to try to get out of here." Rachel and I hurried out of the restroom, the eerie messages echoing in my mind. The clerk at the counter was still there, but his cheery demeanor had faded. His eyes tracked our movements as we made our way toward the exit, his expression unreadable. We didn't speak to him. We didn't say anything at all. I just pushed open the door, and we rushed back to the car, our hearts pounding in unison. Rachel climbed into the passenger seat, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. "Mark, what's going on? How are we? Why does it feel like we're stuck here?" I shook my head, starting the car. "I don't know, but we're leaving." I pulled out of the parking lot, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel as I sped onto the empty road. The night seemed darker now, the sky a suffocating blanket of clouds that blotted out the stars. I could feel Rachel's eyes on me, her fear palpable, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. I needed to focus on getting us out of here. For a while, the road stretched ahead of us, the gas station fading into the distance behind us. I glanced at the dashboard. The clock had reset again, this time reading 3 a.m., but my watch still said it was just after midnight. None of it made sense. But then something shifted. I didn't notice it at first, but the darkness began to lift, the edges of the road becoming more visible. Street lights appeared in the distance, the faint outlines of buildings coming into view. The city. We were almost home. Relief washed over me like a wave. "Rachel, look, we're getting close." She looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We made it." I didn't respond, too focused on the road ahead. The familiar streets of the city began to appear, storefronts, gas stations, the outline of our apartment building in the distance. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. We pulled into the parking lot of our apartment complex, and I let out a long, shaky breath. The tension in my chest began to loosen, and the fog that had clouded my mind started to clear. We were home. Somehow, we had escaped the gas station. Rachel climbed out of the car, still shaken but visibly relieved. "Thank God," she murmured. "Let's just go inside. I need to lie down." We made our way up to our apartment, the familiar sounds of the city comforting in a way I hadn't expected. It was like we had crossed some invisible threshold back into reality, back into normalcy. Inside, the apartment felt safe, normal. I could still hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Everything was just as we had left it. Rachel went to the bathroom to wash up while I wandered into the bedroom, rubbing my tired eyes. I wanted to believe that everything was fine now, that the nightmare was behind us. But as I pulled off my jacket, something felt off. There was a faint smell in the air. At first, I couldn't place it. But then it hit me. Gasoline. The same smell that had lingered in the gas station. My heart started racing again. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. It was just paranoia, a leftover sensation from the gas station. I'd probably spilled some gas on myself when I was filling the car. But then the lights flickered. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The smell of gasoline grew stronger, and the clock on the wall suddenly began to spin, the hands moving rapidly as if time itself was coming unhinged. "Rachel," I called, my voice trembling. She stepped out of the bathroom, her face pale. "Mark, something's wrong." The lights flickered again, plunging the room into brief darkness before flickering back to life. And then I heard it, a faint, familiar jingle, the sound of a bell. I turned slowly toward the front door, my stomach twisting into knots. It was the thin, tall man, entering the apartment. The smell of gasoline was overpowering now, and as the light flickered again, I found myself inside the gas station again, alongside Rachel. We weren't in our apartment anymore. We were back inside the gas station. As the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Rachel clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin, as we both slowly made our way toward the front windows. We pressed our faces to the glass, the world outside blurry in the dim light. For a moment, all I saw was the empty parking lot, the stillness of the night surrounding us. But then, just beyond the edge of the lot, through a thin line of trees, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Our car. It was there, crumpled against a tree, the front end smashed in. Steam billowed from the hood, and the headlights were shattered, casting weak beams of light across the ground. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing. And then I saw us. Rachel and I, still inside the car, slumped over, unmoving. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance as an ambulance pulled up, paramedics rushing toward the wreckage. A police officer stood nearby, speaking into his radio, his face grave. The scene was chaotic, surreal. We watched in stunned silence as the paramedics opened the car doors, pulling out our limp bodies. Our faces, pale and lifeless. Our bodies lay broken and still, surrounded by the flashing lights of a world we couldn't return to.